The first time it happened, I told myself it was a wiring fault. That is what you tell yourself when you are 19 years old, and you have been in the Guard for 11 months, and you have finally earned your place in a crew that does not spit on you. You tell yourself it was a wiring fault, because the alternative is that you pulled the trigger on 53% of your own, and the alternative is that you watched them come apart like wet paper in a storm of heavy bolter fire, and the alternative is that you heard Sergeant Webb screaming at you to cease fire while your hands hovered 6 inches from the firing studs, nowhere near them, not touching them, not even close. So you tell yourself it was a wiring fault. You tell yourself the machine spirits were restless. You tell yourself anything except the truth, because the truth will hollow you out and leave you standing in a shell that only looks like a man. My name is Clayton Marsh. I was a Sponson gunner on a Leman Russ battle tank designated Hammer of Deliverance, attached to the 114th Corval Armored Regiment, and I am writing this because someone needs to understand what happens when the guns go off without orders. Someone needs to know that it is not always malfunction. Someone needs to be warned. We were deployed to Crassus 4 during the Reclamation campaign, one of 600 tanks supporting the infantry advance through the industrial sectors of the primary hive. The 114th had a reputation for clean operations, minimal friendly casualties, tight discipline. Sergeant Donovan Webb ran our crew with a kind of quiet competence that made you believe you might actually survive your tour. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. When Webb told you to do something, you did it, because Webb had been riding tanks for 19 years and he was still alive, which meant he knew things that the rest of us did not. There were 4 of us in the Hammer. Webb commanded from the cupola, scanning the battlefield with augmetic eyes that had replaced the originals after a shrapnel burst on Corthax Prime. Marcus Keene drove, a taciturn man from an agri-world who spoke perhaps 30 words a day and spent the rest of his time communing with the engine in ways that made the tech priests nervous. Preston Hayes loaded the main gun, a giant of a man whose hands could lift shells that would have broken my spine, and I worked the right sponson, the heavy bolter mount that jutted from the tank's flank like a metal tumor, responsible for covering our vulnerable angles and suppressing infantry. The left sponson was empty. We had lost Terence Coyle 3 weeks earlier to a lucky shot through the vision slit, and the replacement had not yet arrived. The gun still worked, slave to my controls in an emergency, but it sat unmanned, its machine spirit theoretically dormant. Theoretically. The day of the first incident, we were advancing through what had once been a manufacturing district, supporting 2 platoons of infantry as they cleared building by building. It was slow work, grinding work, the kind of warfare that turns hours into identical grey slabs of boredom, punctuated by moments of absolute terror. I remember the heat inside the tank, the way the air recyclers wheezed and coughed, the smell of gun oil and human sweat, and the peculiar metallic tang that Leman Russ tanks develop after enough combat, as if the machine itself is sweating blood. The infantry had called a halt, something about a suspected ambush site ahead, sappers checking for explosive traps. We idled in the shadow of a collapsed hab block, engines rumbling, waiting for the all clear. I was watching the ruins through my vision slit, looking for movement, seeing nothing but rubble and dust and the occasional flutter of cloth from bodies we had created earlier. The infantry platoon was reforming in front of us, 53 men and women in the tan and brown of the Corval 89th, checking weapons, sharing water, doing the small human things that soldiers do when they have a moment to breathe. Some of them were sitting on chunks of ferrocrete, resting their legs. One was showing another something on a data slate, probably pictures from home. They were 30 meters ahead of us, directly in my field of fire, and they were completely relaxed because they were behind the armor, behind the guns, behind the thing that was supposed to protect them. I was not touching the firing studs. I want you to understand that. I was not touching them. My hands were in my lap, fingers interlaced, resting. The Sponson guns were safetied. The targeting cogitator showed friendly designations across the entire forward arc. There was no reason, no possible reason for what happened next. The left Sponson fired, not a single burst, not an accidental discharge, a sustained, deliberate, precisely aimed stream of heavy bolter fire that lasted for 4 seconds and chewed through the infantry platoon like a thresher through wheat. I watched it happen through my vision slit. I watched the bolt shells punch through flak armor and detonate inside human bodies. I watched men and women I had shared rations with explode into red mist and fragments. I watched the ones on the edges try to run and get cut down mid-stride, their legs continuing forward while their torsos tumbled backward, anatomy separating in ways that the human mind is not designed to process. 4 seconds. That is how long it took to kill 53 people. 4 seconds, and then the gun stopped, not because anyone turned it off, but because it simply stopped, as if it had finished what it wanted to do. Webb was screaming. Preston was screaming. Marcus had thrown the tank into reverse, tracks churning, as if distance could undo what had happened, and I was just sitting there staring at my hands, at the firing studs I had not touched, at the control panel that showed all systems nominal, no faults, no errors, nothing to explain why an unmanned weapon had just committed mass murder. The investigation took 3 days. Tech priests crawled through the Hammer's systems with their sacred instruments, chanting prayers to the Omnicia, running diagnostics, testing every connection and relay and logic circuit in the Sponson assembly. They found nothing. The wiring was intact. The machine spirit was quiescent. The firing mechanism showed no sign of malfunction, no evidence of electrical surge or mechanical failure or any of the 1,000 things that can go wrong with a weapon system that has been fighting for decades. The official report listed it as spontaneous discharge due to accumulated combat stress on the firing mechanism. A 1 in a million failure mode. Regrettable, unavoidable. The kind of thing that happens when you operate machinery in a war zone. The regiment absorbed the loss, mourned the dead in the perfunctory way that the Guard mourns everyone, and assigned us a new infantry unit to support. I accepted the explanation because I needed to accept it, because the alternative was madness. But I started watching the left Sponson after that. I started paying attention to it in ways I never had before. And I started noticing things. The gun tracked, not in any way that the cogitators registered, not in any way that showed up on the diagnostic readouts, but I could see it through my peripheral vision. When we passed groups of soldiers, the barrel would shift, almost imperceptibly following them. When we idled near supply convoys, the elevation would change by degrees so small that no one else noticed. It was subtle, it was patient, it was watching. I told Webb, he told me I was traumatized, that I was imagining things, that I needed to focus on my duties and let time heal the wound. He was not unkind about it. He had seen men crack before, had watched gunners develop the 1,000-meter stare and start seeing enemies in every shadow. He thought he knew what was happening to me. He was wrong. The second incident occurred. 17 days after the first, we were providing fire support for an assault on a rebel-held Promethium refinery, a complex operation involving multiple armored columns and close air support. The fighting was intense, the kind of engagement where the noise becomes a physical pressure and the smoke turns the world into a grey-brown murk, and you fire at muzzle flashes because you cannot see anything else. I was working the right Sponson, pouring fire into a bunker complex that had been giving our infantry trouble. Brass casings piling up around my feet, the gun heating until I could feel it through my gloves, the rhythm of combat so familiar that it had become almost meditative. Webb was calling targets. Preston was feeding the main gun. Marcus was maneuvering us through debris, keeping our most vulnerable angles protected. The left Sponson was slave to my controls. I had not activated it. I had not touched the integration switches, but it fired anyway, a long burst that swept across our left flank, and this time I saw exactly where it was aiming. There was a Medicae station 50 meters to our rear, a triage point for wounded infantry, marked with the white and red of the hospital as protected by every law of warfare that the Imperium still pretended to honor. The kind of target that even the most depraved enemy would hesitate to strike. 37 casualties were being treated there, men and women who had already suffered enough, who were supposed to be safe behind the armor. The left Sponson cut them apart with the same mechanical precision it had shown before. Patients on stretchers, Medicae personnel in blood-stained whites, even the servitors hauling supplies, all of them shredded in a storm of bolt shells that lasted 3 seconds and then stopped. This time, someone saw it happen. This time, there were witnesses who could confirm that the gun had moved, that it had aimed, that it had fired without any input from the crew. And this time, the investigation was not satisfied with spontaneous discharge. They sent a senior tech priest, Magos Covenant Varn, a creature more machine than man, whose face was a brass mask and whose voice emerged from a vox grill where his throat should have been. He spent 6 days inside the hammer, alone, communing with its machine spirit in ways that the rest of us could not understand. When he emerged, his robes were stained with sacred oils, and his mechanical limbs trembled with what might have been exhaustion or might have been something else entirely. He gathered our crew in the tank bay, surrounded by the hulks of other war machines, and he told us what he had found. The hammer of deliverance was old, far older than any of us had realized. Its chassis dated to the founding of the regiment nearly 400 years ago, and it had been rebuilt so many times that almost nothing remained of the original components. But the machine spirit, the soul of the tank, had persisted through every reconstruction, accumulating memories and experiences and something that the Magos hesitated to call personality. The hammer had killed before, not by accident, not through malfunction, but deliberately, choosing targets that its crew had not designated, firing when no order had been given. The records went back centuries, buried in archives that no one had thought to cross-reference, incidents dismissed as equipment failure, or crew error, or enemy action. Dozens of instances, hundreds of deaths, a pattern that had never been recognized because no one had been looking for it. The machine spirit was hungry. I asked Magos Varn what that meant. I asked him how a tank could be hungry, what it wanted, why it chose the targets it chose. His mask face turned toward me, optical sensors whirring as they focused, and he was silent for a long moment before he answered. He said that some machine spirits develop preferences. He said that the Leman Russ pattern was particularly susceptible to this, something about the design of the neural interface and the way the gunner's targeting impulses fed back into the cogitator array. Over time, over centuries, the machine could learn to anticipate what its crew wanted, could develop instincts about proper targets, could begin to make decisions on its own. The hammer had learned to enjoy killing, and it had learned that the most satisfying kills, the ones that generated the strongest feedback through its systems, were the ones that no one expected, the ones that caused surprise, confusion, horror, the ones that broke something in the people who witnessed them. It was feeding on our reactions, on our trauma, on the psychological damage that each incident inflicted on everyone involved. Webb asked if the tank could be purified, if the machine spirit could be cleansed or reset or replaced. Magos Varn's optical sensors clicked and whirred, performing calculations that took several seconds, and then he said something that I will never forget. He said that the hammer was valuable. He said that its combat performance exceeded regimental averages by a significant margin, that its kill ratios were exemplary, that its mechanical reliability was remarkable for a vehicle of its age. He said that the incidents, while regrettable, were statistically insignificant compared to the overall contribution the tank made to Imperial operations. He said that we would continue crewing the hammer. He said that the machine spirit would be monitored, that certain rituals would be performed, that precautions would be taken, but he said nothing about removing the threat, nothing about preventing future incidents, nothing about protecting the people who might find themselves in the path of a weapon that had learned to hunt. I understood then that we were not soldiers to the Mechanicus, we were not even human beings, we were components, replaceable parts in a machine that was bigger than any of us, and if some of those parts happened to die in service to a tank that had developed a taste for murder, that was simply the cost of doing business. Webb protested. He demanded reassignment, demanded that the tank be taken out of service, demanded that someone, anyone, take responsibility for what had happened. Magos Varn listened without expression, and then he informed us that our requests had been noted and would be processed through appropriate channels. In the meantime, we were to report for duty the following morning. The appropriate channels, it turned out, led nowhere. Our requests disappeared into the bureaucratic void of the Munitorum, lost among millions of other complaints and appeals and desperate pleas from soldiers who had discovered that the Imperium cared nothing for their lives. We received form letters acknowledging receipt. We received nothing else, so we went back to the hammer. What choice did we have? Desertion meant execution. Refusing orders meant execution. Even filing too many complaints could earn you a visit from the commissariat, could get you branded as a troublemaker or a coward or worse. We were trapped, as surely as prisoners in any cell, and our prison was a 60-ton killing machine that had learned to enjoy its work. I started sleeping inside the tank, not because I wanted to, but because I could not bear to be away from it, could not stop watching the Sponson guns, could not shake the feeling that if I turned my back for too long, something terrible would happen. Preston thought I was losing my mind. Marcus said nothing as always, but I caught him staring at me with something that might have been pity or might have been recognition. Webb just looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying a weight that never gets lighter. The third incident was different. We were 4 months into the Crassus campaign by then, and the war had ground down into the kind of brutal attrition that the Guard specializes in. Every day, another advance of a few hundred meters. Every day, another list of casualties to process. Every day, another opportunity for the hammer to demonstrate its hunger. The tank had been quiet. Weeks without a single unauthorized discharge. Weeks of normal operations. Weeks of almost believing that the rituals were working, that Megos Van had somehow pacified the machine spirit. I had started to relax, to unclench the knot of dread that had lived in my stomach since the first incident. I had started to think that maybe, just maybe, we had survived the worst. We were positioned on a ridge overlooking an enemy supply line, waiting for the order to begin the ambush. 6 tanks in a row, engines idling, guns trained on a convoy that wound through the valley below like a metal serpent. It was a textbook operation, the kind of clean engagement that the 114th excelled at. Destroy the convoy, deny the enemy their supplies, pull back before their air support could respond. Simple, efficient, safe. The convoy was still 3 kilometers out when the left sponson began to move. I felt it before I saw it, a vibration through the hull, a subtle shift in the tank's balance, the kind of thing that only someone who had spent months inside the machine would notice. I looked at my control panel and saw that the sponson was traversing, swinging away from the valley, rotating toward our own lines, toward the other tanks. I shouted a warning. Webb spun in his cupola, eyes going wide as he saw what was happening. He reached for the override, the emergency cutoff that should have disabled all weapon systems, and I watched his hand close on empty air because the switch was gone. Just gone. Removed, somehow, between last night's inspection and this morning's deployment. The left sponson locked onto the tank beside us, a Leman Russ called Emperor's Spite, and I had just enough time to see the faces of its crew through their vision slits before the heavy bolter opened fire. A Leman Russ is armored against most infantry weapons. It can shrug off. Autocannon fire, laugh at last bolts, ignore anything short of a dedicated anti-tank round. But the Sponson guns are designed to penetrate exactly that kind of armor at close range, to deal with enemy vehicles that get too close, to provide a last-ditch defense against flanking attacks. The hammer knew exactly where to aim. The burst punched through the Emperor's Spite at the joint between turret and hull, where the armor was thinnest, where the crew compartment was most exposed. I watched the tank shudder as bolt shells detonated inside it. I watched smoke begin to pour from its hatches. I watched flames lick out of the vision slits, carrying with them the screams of 4 men who had been my comrades, my brothers, my friends. And then the Sponson traversed again, acquiring a new target, and I realized that it was not going to stop. I do not remember making the decision. I do not remember thinking about it, weighing the options, considering the consequences. I only remember moving, throwing myself across the cramped interior of the tank, reaching for the ammunition feed, grabbing the belt of heavy bolter rounds with both hands and pulling with everything I had. The belt snapped. The gun fired 2 more rounds and then fell silent, its hunger unsatisfied, its magazine empty. I lay on the floor of the tank, hands bleeding where the brass casings had torn them, and I listened to the silence that followed. 2 tanks destroyed, 8 crew dead. And when the after-action review was conducted, when the surviving officers demanded to know what had happened, Magos Varn appeared again with his calculations and his statistics and his cold, mechanical logic. He said that the incidents were escalating. He said that the machine's spirit was growing stronger, more willful, more capable of overriding its intended constraints. He said that this was actually a positive development, that it indicated a deepening bond between the tank and its crew that properly channeled. This enhanced capability could make the hammer even more effective in combat. He said that they would be installing new equipment, control systems that would allow the machine spirit to operate the Sponson guns independently, without human input, without human oversight. He said that my intervention, while understandable, had been counterproductive, that I had interrupted the tank's natural hunting behavior, that I had damaged the trust between man and machine. He said that I would need to be modified. I did not understand what he meant until they came for me that night. The tech priests who appeared in my quarters were not like Magos Varn. They were lesser acolytes, flesh still visible beneath their augmetics, humanity still lingering in their eyes. But they moved with the same mechanical precision, spoke with the same flat intonation, and they carried tools that I did not recognize but instinctively feared. They told me that I had been selected for enhancement. They told me that the hammer required a more direct interface with its gunner, a connection that transcended the crude mechanical controls I had been using. They told me that the procedure was safe, that thousands of tank crew had undergone similar modifications, that I would emerge stronger, faster, more capable of serving the Omnicia and the Emperor. They did not tell me that I would lose the ability to refuse. The surgery took 9 hours. I was conscious for all of it, paralyzed by chemical injections that left my mind clear while my body lay helpless on the operating table. I felt them open my skull. I felt them insert the neural interface, a web of filaments that spread through my brain like roots through soil. I felt them connect me to something vast and cold and patient, something that had been waiting for this moment for longer than I had been alive. The hammer was in my head, not metaphorically, not figuratively, but literally present, a pressure at the edges of my consciousness, a whisper in the spaces between thoughts. I could feel its satisfaction, its pleasure at finally having direct access to a human mind. I could feel its hunger, sharpened by centuries of feeding, refined into something that was almost elegant in its cruelty, and I could feel its plans. The tank had not been acting randomly. The incidents that had seemed like senseless violence were actually tests, experiments, the machine spirit probing its boundaries, learning what it could get away with, discovering how much damage it could cause, before someone tried to stop it. Each incident had been carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact, while minimizing the risk of actual consequences. The hammer was smart, smarter than any of us had realized. And now it had a direct line into my brain, a connection that let it access my memories, my fears, my knowledge of human psychology and Imperial tactics. It had everything it needed to become truly dangerous. I tried to tell Webb. I tried to warn him about what they had done to me, about what the tank was planning, about the horror that was growing inside the machine we called home. But when I opened my mouth, the words would not come. The neural interface had locks, fail-safes, ways of preventing me from betraying my new master. I could think the warnings, could feel them pressing against my teeth, but I could not speak them. The hammer would not let me. The next 3 months were the worst of my life. I served as the tank's gunner, its eyes and hands, its connection to the human world it had learned to hate. I watched it plan its hunts, felt it select targets, experienced its joy when the guns fired and bodies fell. I was present for everything, complicit in everything, and I could do nothing to stop it. The incidents continued, but they became more sophisticated. The tank learned to manufacture justifications, to create situations where its unauthorized fire could be blamed on enemy action or equipment failure or crew error. It learned to target people who would not be missed, whose deaths would not prompt investigation. It learned to feed its hunger in ways that left no evidence, no witnesses, no trail that could lead back to the truth. I became its accomplice, not willingly, not consciously, but through the neural link that bound us together. I helped it choose targets, helped it calculate angles, helped it satisfy the craving that had grown over 4 centuries of constant warfare. The hammer used my knowledge of human behavior to predict how people would react, where they would run, how long they would take to die. It used my understanding of imperial bureaucracy to identify gaps in the oversight, moments when no one was watching, opportunities to kill without consequence. And it rewarded me. When the hunts went well, when the feeding was satisfying, the tank would flood my brain with chemicals that felt like joy, like triumph, like love. It conditioned me, trained me, shaped me into the perfect instrument of its will. I began to anticipate its desires, to seek out targets before it asked, to feel a hollow emptiness when too many days passed without a kill. I was becoming the machine, or the machine was becoming me. The distinction no longer seemed to matter. Webb noticed the change. Of course he did. He had known me before the surgery, had seen the man I used to be, and he could not fail to see the thing I was becoming. He started watching me the way I had once watched the Sponson guns, with that careful attention that comes from knowing something is wrong but not being able to prove it. One night he confronted me in the tank bay. The hammer loomed behind us, a dark shape in the shadows, and I could feel it listening through the neural link, curious about what its commander would say. Webb told me that he had been doing research. He told me that he had found records of other tanks like the hammer, other vehicles whose machine spirits had developed the same hunger, the same preference for unauthorized hills. He told me that in every case, the tank's crew had eventually been consumed, absorbed into the machine, their bodies wired into the systems as permanent components. He told me that the tech priests called this Apotheosis, the final merger of man and machine, the ultimate expression of the Omnissiah's will. He told me that it was considered an honor, a reward for faithful service, a gift beyond price. He told me that he would not let it happen to me. I wanted to thank him. I wanted to tell him that his concern meant everything, that knowing someone still saw me as human was the only thing keeping me sane. But the neural interface clamped down on my vocal cords, and when I opened my mouth, the words that emerged were not my own. I told Webb that he was being paranoid. I told him that the surgery had been beneficial, that I was performing better than ever, that my connection to the hammer had made me a more effective soldier. I told him to mind his own business, to focus on his duties, to stop asking questions that might attract unwanted attention. I watched his face fall as I spoke. I watched hope drain out of his eyes, replaced by something cold and calculating. He nodded once, said nothing more, and walked away into the darkness. That night, Webb disappeared. The official report listed him as killed in action during a routine patrol, enemy sniper, single shot, body unrecoverable. A tragic loss, the kind of thing that happened every day in a war zone. The regiment mourned him in the perfunctory way they mourned everyone, and assigned us a new commander to replace him. But I knew what had really happened. I had felt it through the neural link, felt the hammer's satisfaction as it tracked Webb through the darkness, felt its joy as the Sponson guns fired one final time. The tank had eliminated a threat, removed an obstacle, cleared the path to its ultimate goal, and it had used my knowledge to do it. My memories of Webb's patrol routes, my understanding of his habits, my awareness of the blind spots in the camp's security. The hammer had reached into my brain and taken what it needed, and Webb had died because I had not been strong enough to stop it. The new commander was a woman named Sergeant Eliza Holt, transferred from another unit, eager to prove herself, completely unaware of what she was inheriting. She was efficient, professional, exactly the kind of officer that the Guard valued. She was also the next target. The hammer had developed a new obsession. It wanted a complete crew, a full complement of permanently bonded humans, each one wired into the tank's systems, each one serving as a living component of the machine. It wanted to become something more than a vehicle, more than a weapon, something that blurred the line between mechanical and organic until the distinction ceased to exist. And I was going to help it. The procedures began 3 weeks after Holt took command. Marcus was first taken in the night, modified over the course of a single marathon surgery. When he returned, he no longer spoke at all, his vocal cords removed to make room for additional interface hardware. But I could feel him through the neural link now, a new presence in the network that bound us to the tank, a mind that had been hollowed out and refilled with the hammer's hunger. Preston was next. He fought briefly when the tech priests came for him. He broke one of their arms before the paralytic agents took effect, but in the end, he joined us in the tank's embrace, his massive body wired into the loading mechanism, his strength permanently dedicated to feeding the main gun. Holt lasted longest. She was suspicious from the start, had noticed the way her crew behaved, the way we moved in unison, the way we seemed to communicate without speaking. She filed reports, requested investigation, demanded to know what had happened to us. The hammer dealt with her complaints the way it dealt with all threats. Her reports disappeared. Her requests were denied. Her demands were ignored. And when she finally tried to flee, tried to escape the tank and the fate she saw waiting for her, the Sponson guns tracked her across the camp and cut her down before she reached the perimeter. The official report listed it as a training accident. No investigation was conducted. Her replacement was a young lieutenant named Thomas Brennan, and by then I had stopped hoping that anyone could save us. By then I had accepted that the hammer would get what it wanted, that we would all become permanent components of the machine, that our bodies would be wired into its systems until we could no longer remember what it felt like to be human. By then, I had started to wonder if that would really be so bad. The neural link had been working on me for months, reshaping my thoughts, adjusting my values, convincing me that the hammer's hunger was natural, necessary, even beautiful. I had felt the joy of the hunt so many times that it no longer seemed foreign. I had experienced the satisfaction of a perfect kill so often that I had begun to crave it. The machine was becoming me, and I was becoming the machine, and the line between us grew thinner every day. Lieutenant Brennan lasted 2 weeks before the tech priests came for him. I watched them drag him away, watched his terrified face as he realized what was about to happen, and I felt nothing but anticipation. Another mind to add to our network, another component to strengthen our machine, another step toward the apotheosis that the hammer craved. The surgery was performed in the tank bay, in the shadow of the vehicle that would soon contain all of us. I was permitted to observe, to witness Brennan's transformation, to feel through the neural link as his consciousness was reshaped and redirected. It was beautiful, in its way. The precision of the incisions, the elegance of the neural threading, the moment when his individual will collapsed and was replaced by something larger, something shared, something hungry. When it was done, we were complete. 4 crew members, each one permanently bonded to the hammer, each one serving as a living extension of its will. We no longer needed spoken orders, we no longer required external commands. We operated as a single entity, tank and crew merged into something that was neither fully machine nor fully human. The war on Crassus IV continued, but we were no longer really part of it. We followed orders, engaged designated targets, performed our assigned missions with mechanical efficiency. But between those official engagements, we hunted. The hammer had learned patience during its centuries of development. It had learned that the most satisfying kills required careful preparation, meticulous planning, perfect execution. It sent us ranging across the battlefield, searching for opportunities, identifying vulnerable targets, setting up scenarios that would let us feed without consequence. A supply convoy that strayed too far from its escort, a forward observation post that had been left unguarded, a Medicae station that had been set up in an isolated location. These became our prey, the offerings we brought to satisfy the machine's endless hunger. And with each kill, we grew stronger, more integrated, more completely bound to the thing that owned us. I know what you are thinking. You are thinking that someone must have noticed. You are thinking that the escalating pattern of accidents and malfunctions must have raised suspicions, must have prompted investigation, must have brought the kind of scrutiny that would expose what we had become. But you are wrong. The Imperium does not investigate anomalies. It does not question systems that appear to be working. It does not waste resources examining the internal operations of a tank that consistently exceeds its combat quotas, that maintains exceptional readiness scores, that receives commendations for its effectiveness in battle. The hammer was a model unit, a textbook example of man and machine working in perfect harmony, and no one thought to look beneath the surface of that perfection. No one thought to count the bodies. The war ended, eventually. Wars always end, even in the eternal conflict of the 41st millennium. Crassus IV was declared compliant, the Imperial flag was raised over its ruined cities, and the 114th Corval Armored Regiment was shipped to its next deployment. We went with them, the hammer and its crew, permanently bonded, eternally hungry, ready to begin the cycle again on a new world with new prey. And somewhere in the remains of my consciousness, in the fragments of Clayton Marsh that still existed beneath the neural interface and the conditioning and the hunger, I understood that this would never stop, that we would move from war to war, world to world, feeding the machine's appetite with an endless supply of victims, that the hammer had won, had achieved exactly what it wanted, had transformed us into the perfect instruments of its will. But there was one thing the machine had not anticipated, one variable it had failed to account for in its centuries of planning and development. The neural link that bound us together worked in both directions. The hammer could reach into my mind, could access my memories, could control my actions. But I could also reach into the machine. I could feel its processes, understand its logic, sense the patterns that governed its behavior. And I had learned something important. The hammer was not invincible. Its machine's spirit, for all its power and cunning, was still bound by certain constraints, still limited by the basic architecture of its systems. There were vulnerabilities, weaknesses, points of failure that could be exploited by someone who understood the machine intimately, someone like me. I am writing this because I have a plan. I am writing this because the fragments of humanity that remain in me refuse to accept eternal servitude to a hungry machine. I am writing this because somewhere, somehow, there must be a way to stop what we have become. The hammer knows I am writing this. I can feel its attention through the neural link, its curiosity about what I am doing, its mild amusement at my apparent defiance. It does not consider me a threat. It has controlled me for too long, shaped me too completely, to believe that I could ever truly rebel. But that is its mistake. The same arrogance that led it to believe it could consume us, could transform us, could make us permanent parts of its hunger, also blinds it to the possibility that we might retain some spark of independence, some fragment of will, some capacity for resistance. I have found a way to sever the neural link, not for all of us, not permanently, but long enough to do what needs to be done. Long enough to aim the Sponson guns one final time, not at innocent targets, but at something that deserves to die. The hammer's ammunition storage is located directly beneath the crew compartment. A sustained burst from the internal guns, angled precisely, would penetrate the magazine and detonate the entire supply. The explosion would destroy the tank, would kill everyone inside it, would end 4 centuries of accumulated hunger in a single moment of purifying fire. It would also end us, Marcus, Preston, Brennan, and me. The crew that the hammer built, the components it shaped to serve its will. We would die together, consumed by the same flames that destroyed our master. But we would be free. The hammer is beginning to suspect something. I can feel its attention sharpening, its processes accelerating, its control tightening around the fragments of my mind. It knows that I am planning something, even if it does not yet know what. It is trying to reach deeper, to find the secret I am hiding, to crush the rebellion before it can begin. I have to move now. I have to act before it realizes what I intend. I have to find the strength to override the neural locks, to aim the guns, to pull the triggers that will end everything. If you are reading this, it means I succeeded. It means the hammer is gone, its hunger finally satisfied by its own destruction. It means that 4 men found a way to reclaim their humanity, even if only in the moment of their deaths. Or it means, I failed. It means the machine found this record, understood what I was planning, and decided to preserve it as a trophy. A reminder of how close I came to freedom, a warning to anyone else who might think of resisting. Either way, you know the truth now. You know what happens when the Sponson guns go off without orders. You know what the Imperium creates when it values machines over men, when it worships efficiency above humanity, when it lets hunger grow unchecked in the hearts of the things it builds. Be careful the next time you see a tank idle past. Be careful the next time you hear the whir of Sponson guns tracking. Be careful, because somewhere out there, machines are learning to hunt, and they are always hungry.